Yes, there we are, the Northern Limestone Alps. Okay, this bottom picture is a little bit dark and gloomy. This is taken in autumn, last visit in October, most probably to collect seed. The Alpine Garden itself is at 1860 meters. Now, all my measurements are going to be metric, I'm afraid, but I think everybody, I hope, is conversant with metric. And we are here. We're actually in the grazing meadows, the summer grazing for the cows. The Schachen is not actually a mountain called Schachen. It's this area here that is a meadow, a grazing area, and that is called the Schachen. It's this mountain, this is the Dreitorspitz, and they've all got, and Frauenalp Spitz, but the Schachen itself is not a mountain. Okay, and as I say, we're part of the Northern Limestone Alps. The snow lies until the end of May, but we'll see some of that a bit later. The Alpine Garden was opened in 1901, 14th of July, and it was thanks to Professor Carl von Goebel that we have the Schachen Garden. He was very keen to have a garden up in the Alps. He wanted a laboratory in the blockhouse so that they could do different sort of like work on plants and the sugars that they made, I think he was, and the difference between the plants growing up in the Alps and the same plants if they grew them down in the valleys. Even though it was opened in 1901, the laboratory only came in 1930, 32. So they did only about 3 years of laboratory work. This is the group of people who hiked up, 3 hours hike to get up there for the opening of the garden. Now, this garden was opened at a time when a number of alpine gardens opened in the European Alps. You could say that it was almost like a fashion suddenly, but it was because there was a growing desire or market for alpine plants. Collecting alpines and growing them in England had become quite a big thing, and tourists in the Alpine valleys were increasing, and wagon loads of plants like the rhododendron, hirsutum, and edelweiss, also the daphnes, they were being dug out and either taken to the valleys, sold to the tourists, or shipped to England. So all of these alpine gardens were actually started to try to protect the natural vegetation. And there are only these 7 that are still existing. There are a lot of other alpine gardens, but these 7 are the oldest that are still exist. And the Schachen was one of the few that from the start, we also had exotic plants. This is just to give you an idea of how many alpine gardens there are in the European Alps above 1,000 meters. Below 1,000 meters, there are even more. We are about 120 kilometers from Munich, south of Munich, which nowadays is not that difficult to reach with the Autobahn and driving up. But I know that up until definitely the 50s, the gardeners would be going there by train. They'd go to Kleis, which is about here, with their goods they were working 14 to 16 weeks at that time. The innkeeper from our neighbors, the Schachen house, fetched them in his mule cart and all their goods. We now drive up. We belong to the Botanic Garden of Munich. Munich itself has a very large rock garden, the Alpinum, and this is in May. That's their main flowering time. Apart from the Schachen, I also do the propagation in Munich, and I look after an alpine show house, which is there where we have, and now mainly it's planted art, but we have some areas where the bulbs and Dionysias and other plants can be shown. All of the propagation is done in the Munich Botanic Garden. This is due to our very short season up on the Schachen. We have, I would say, about a 14-week growing season from frost to frost. So that's very short, even for the high alpine plants. So even though Aprils are becoming already a little bit hot and a bit of a challenge for plants like Mecanopsis or Gentiana fralici, which is from the higher mountains and are much more sensitive to heat. We still do the propagation down in Munich. I've got the propagation house, and then I think it's 20 frames, but those are filled with not only propagation, but also bulbs and other sort of like reserve collections of sempervivums and saxifrages. The Schachen plants are all planted into plastic pots, makes them easier to transport in the baskets. All the other plants are actually still very old-fashioned, plunged in frames, and then so that we can shade them as well in Munich. Now, getting up to the Schachen, for us, we've got a Suzuki Jeep. We used to only have the Unimog, which needed a special driver. This was our Unimog driver, Bernhard. Now they've actually no longer used the Unimog, which is also a pity because we could pack a lot of stuff into the Unimog. The Suzuki Jeep with a trailer can't take a lot up. For visitors, it's a 3-hour hike because to drive this on the forestry road, you can see people hiking up here. You need a special permit, and only the people who work up there or work in one of the huts get the permits. It's not too strenuous a hike, and there's a possibility to overnight in the Schachen house as well. This is what used to be a typical Schachen weather, Schachen day, which is nice, cool, moist air, misty, very good for all the Himalayan monsoon plants that we have, like the Primulas, the Mecanopsis, even the indigenous vegetation. They're all need this cool, wet weather. This has started to change. We have less misty days, longer, drier periods, same amount of rain, but it's falling more as cloudbursts than as sort of like a gentle rain spread over days. This is, I'm sorry, it's not in English, but this is just to show the difference between Munich, for instance, this purple is the Munich rainfall, Schachen rainfall, and the Zugspitze, which is only about 1 kilometer away from the Schachen. It's the highest point in Germany at 2,900. That we have much higher rainfall and also temperatures. This is Munich's temperature, the green, where it's hotter, of course, the Schachen and the Zugspitze. So this cooler, moister air does enable us to grow a lot more plants, alpines that we couldn't manage to grow in Munich. This was an exceptional year where we still had snow in June. It's usually May, most of it's melted by the beginning of June or end of May. This is also 10th of June. We had planned to open on the 12th of June and we put it back a week, pushed it back another week. Our first visit is always the end of May, where we usually hike up. Very seldom that the roads will be clear at this time of the year. You see, this is our neighbor, the Schachen Schloss, and the Alpine Garden is down here. And just some of the plants that grow in the meadows there. So Crocus albiflorus, some people call it albiflorus vernus. That's Soldanella montana, Primula auricula, and Gentiana verna. The garden is just under 1 hectare. The fenced-in area, the planted-up area is about half of that. We're arranged, the whole garden is arranged geographically. The Alps being the brown colors, the Carpathians, Rocky Mountains. Himalaya is a very large collection. Southern Hemisphere is fairly new collection, Caucasus and so on. And I'll start with the Himalaya and with the Mecanopsis, because that is really something that plants that do very well for us, even now, although we can no longer grow them in full sun. We used to be able to, when I started in '94, we could grow these Mecanopsis in full sun without a problem. And now we find they need partly shaded areas. So a lot of the plants have been moved into semi-shaded areas. And I'd say at the moment I have about 18 in culture, Mecanopsis, different species, it's about 14, and 4 hybrids. We try to stick with species throughout for the whole garden, being a botanic alpine garden. I'm not sure how many of you are growing Mecanopsis, but you know the Punetea quintuplinova, and this is a natural hybrid, but this one has been remade. This was Ian Christie's, one of his crosses between the 2 old rows. The Mecanopsis do tend to cross-pollinate quite happily and freely, which can result in a lot of hybrids. We want to try and keep them pure. So, for instance, with this paniculata that dies after flowering, it's monocarpic. We cover some of the plants, not every year, but maybe every 3rd or 4th year. I'll cover some that are in flower with an insect netting, and we'll hand pollinate so that we can have pure seed for the next generations. Seed is kept in the fridge in Munich, and so far I've noticed that we can keep it at least up to 8 years at least, and it'll still be viable. We can still keep sowing and having increase the collection or keep the collection going. Because it's very difficult nowadays. You can't get these plants from the wild anymore, or it's extremely difficult to get source plants from the wild. So we have to do everything we can to try to keep them pure, to keep them going. This is Mecanopsis stantoni. See, I was a bit slow with covering the plants, so all of those that had already been exposed, sort of cross-pollinated freely, open pollination, I cut the flowers off. It's a very, very nice plant, very red. With our climate, that is very good for the Mecanopsis. They do also sow themselves as weeds. More of the Mecanopsis complexa, what used to be called Napalensis. This one had no chance because, you know, it just needs more food that it's going to get growing in that crack. They do tend to sow themselves, and 2 that I allowed to sow themselves so that I don't have to sow them are Peridula and complexa, and I don't need to do that. Otherwise, as say, propagation is done in Munich. I'll sow the seed in either late November or early the 1st week of January. I don't like to sow any Mecanopsis after the 1st week of January because there's a lot of them won't germinate early enough so that I've got the young plants. I don't prick them out. I will actually directly plant them. I'll just take clumps out and plant the Mecanopsis, seeing as they're so sensitive to hot weather. Hot weather is anything above 20. I like to get them established before the warm weather starts in April. Same with the Rheum nobile, and those were also very sensitive to heat when they're young, particularly. Anyway, so in a good year, we have a good amount of Mecanopsis and other plants, Premantodiums and Rheums, whatever is basically needed that year to take up. What we are also doing now, since I had Christian Neifel from Tromsø Alpine and Arctic Botanic Garden working with us up on the Schachen, he suggested that for the taller plants, the monocarps like Welichi, that we collect cow dung. There's plenty of cow dung outside, and mix that in with the soil because they're heavy feeders and they need a lot more fertilizer than than we've actually been giving them. So while he was there, we went out and collected lots of the cow manure and tipped it in there. And because we had plants that were ready to plant out, and we didn't want to wait for the 1 year for the manure to, what would you say, ripen or to mature. It was mixed 1-to-1, by the way, with the soil. And then we put newspaper on top and then soil without manure, just as deep as the pots. Planted all the Mecanopsis and the Rheums, because the theory was, and it worked, that the roots wouldn't grow through the newspaper until the year after, when the manure would have been fully matured. And the Welichi did very well for the first time after using this method. So we now do it all the time, collect the fresh manure every year. And I now have a good stock of already matured manure. Anyway, Betonetzifolia, I know this is also under the name of Bailey. I'm not yet sure really if this isn't perhaps truly Betonetzifolia. That's still got to be decided. It's an old plant, been with us for a long time, since Dieter Schacht. They're 50 years old, I would say. We do have to sort of replant Primulas and Meconopsis every 7 years or so, refresh the soil, divide the plants. And then we have these very special ones, the small growing. Also, unfortunately, both of them are monocarp, so they die after flowering. Difficult because we don't often have two flowering at the same time, and they don't really sell very well. Very nice. The Yashoensis is perhaps 10 centimeters maximum tall. The Balangensis, that's a bit taller, about 15 centimeters when it's fully extended. We also have a very good collection of Himalayan Primulas, although nothing near complete. And there was something like 260 Primulas growing in the Sino-Himalayas. All of these are actually all very old, except for the Viali. Viali is quite common in culture, but in Munich it's grown and kept just as almost like a summer bedding. It's a biennial, and we tried it up on the Schachen, and it's perennial. Every year it comes up and flowers quite late in the year, very light, or in the summer, much liked by the visitors because they always mistake it for an orchid. In German, it's called the orchid primula. Another very interesting primula that we have is the reptans. I'm pretty sure this was collected by Dieter Schacht on one of his trips to Nepal. And as you can see, it's very small. And the problem are the mosses. The mosses start to choke the plant, and then we'll dig it up and replant it. It makes rhizomes. This is one of the first things we'll water. If it doesn't rain for 3 days, then we water it. Our soil here is, of course, it's very stony in the mountain. The drainage is incredibly good. Without rain, things can dry out very quickly. I don't think I mentioned it, but we're on the north side of the mountain. That's why the snow lies so long. And it's not really very good for mats and cushion plants, because also not only the long snow cover, but also the wet summers. But these are ones that do very well. Have been with us for about 30, 40 years. Some things do very well and last forever, and others I wish that I'd collected and kept seed in the fridge. The Selenia nigrescens we've actually lost. Also a Himalayan plant, which I find these Selenies very nice, look like little caps, like the housemaids used to wear or something. And another favorite of mine are Cremantodiums. They flower quite late in our year. They start to grow fairly late as well. You know, with some of the new ones that I've tried, like Elyssi, think that they haven't come through the winter, because they'll only start to protrude above the soil around about end of June. So they're not straight away, not as soon as the snow melts. Unlike other things, like this lily is fairly quick and it flowers beginning of July. It's now under Lilium, but it's we've still got as Nemocharis oxypetalum, quite a short lily, 20 centimeters. Very similar, I find, to Lilium nanum, and I haven't been able to find, are they actually the same thing or not? I hope not, but because I do like Nemocharis. And they're not really that long-lived. I'm not sure about this one. We've had it since 2015. I sowed the seed, and it's still doing well. But other Nemocharis we've had, they've lasted about 8 to 10 years, and then they seem to weaken, and we have to resow. But Nemocharis come very quickly from seed. They're immediate epigale, so they're at 18 degrees. They'll germinate within 3 weeks. And then, so I'll sow them in January, and then slowly, once they're at this stage, I move them into a house that's, I think here it's 12 degrees, and slowly get them used to cooler temperatures. And they will flower in the 3rd year. Other lilies that we have, this is one from the Balkans, Carneolicum subspecies yonki. We do have, in some years, a problem with mice, especially in the winter. If the mouse population is very large, then they will survive the winter burrowing under the snow. They'll live there, like they have tunnels, half in the soil, half in the snow. And one year I know they went through like a rotavator through the Lilium carneolicum, the Yankees, and I thought that we'd lost them, but because the bulbs are actually so loose, you can see how loose the scales are kept. They had eaten a lot, but they'd also propagated a lot. They'd spread the scales all over in that area, and we now have doubled them up. We have a lot, and we dug them up and replanted them, and took all the excess scales and propagated them in Munich, which also with this lily was really quite easy and to do. This is peat. In October, I put the scales in here. This photo was taken in February, the year after, where they've already got small bulbs. And this bag, where the peat is slightly moist, and this bag, I kept it in a drawer in the seed room, which has a temperature of about 18 degrees. And the drawer's dark, so they grew. And this is now a couple of years later. We had a nice load of plants. So because it's nice if they make a big display, if you've got a lot of the plants. So one of our earliest flowering plants, this flowers actually straight after snow melt, before the visitors get a chance to see it. We open about 2 weeks usually after snow melt, middle of June. Yeah, middle of June. One of the few Adonis, well, it's another Adonis that likes very wet summers. Most Adonis do like it dry in summer, but this one from the Pyrenees likes it wet. Seeds itself quite readily, but like so many of these Adonis, the seeds are not long-lived. We store them in the fridge just until we have a seed catalogue that goes out to other botanic gardens, and it's just for 6 months, and so that we can distribute it to other alpine gardens. Another plant been up there for a long time, the Aranea purpurescens, also from the Pyrenees, as is the Androsaceae carnea subspecies lageri. This is a plant that likes to grow acidic. All our rocks are limestone from the area. The garden is small, so years and years ago, they decided, we've kept to it, that we'll only use the local rocks for landscaping, because otherwise it can very quickly become too unruhig, too much of a jumble if you've got too many different rocks being used in such a small garden. But the soil, we will have used acidic soil, and then we also mix in quite a bit of a granite that's sort of breaking down, and as it breaks down, it does help to keep acidic. Other plants from the Pyrenees, this ranunculus is very nice because it's got this pink tinge on the back. We don't have snails. We don't have much of a snail problem up on the Schachen. We've only got the snails with houses, not slugs. The slugs in Munich are a major problem. But now as the summers warm up, we're getting more and more of a problem with slugs. And these are flowers that the slugs really like to eat. We're not allowed to use poisons of any sort, so we'll sort of collect them and kill them. But there's not much else we can do. The Buclosoides is an endemic from the Pyrenees, from a moist area. Very nice. They start off sort of pinkish and turn blue. And of course, gentians, blue gentians and edelweiss are perhaps what most of our visitors want to see, or any of the visitors who don't know alpines. That's the plant they want to see in the garden. You can never have enough. Then moving on to the Central Alps, these also mainly acidic plants that we have for the Central Alps. We redid this area, it'll be about 10 years ago now, and it's still doing okay. It's still got this granite that's sort of like, it's very unstable granite, so it breaks down and lets out a lot of. Unfortunately, we lost the Campanula excisor purely because the shoots are so similar to a weed that we have in this group. And so over time, it's been weeded out by mistake. So I must get more young plants to replace it. This is one of the Androsaceae that I think this one is bravest. Sorry, I can't see my names up there. But this one, I don't know anyone else who has it in culture. We nearly lost it a couple of years back because we had hardly any snow in the winter. Or I think it was more that January we had no snow and they got frostburned. They have recovered quite well. And the same, we've also got Androsaceae vulfeniana, also one that is very, very seldom in culture. I'm not sure if they're more common in England, but none of the botanic gardens or alpine gardens are growing these two plants. You never see them offered anywhere either. Also get a very special gentian, Frelicii. You get it in the Yugoslavian Alps and Trentino, above Trentino in the Alps, in that area, southeastern Europe. There's a very nice blue flowers, sort of midsummer, so August with us, it'll flower. They never open more than that. Very nice lung plant as it grows in limestone. More limestone primulas from the Eastern Alps, Clusiana. These don't do well in Munich. They'll grow, but they don't flower. And in nature and on the Schachen, they'll flower straight after snow melt. So it's another plant that our visitors very seldom see. Last year they did flower when the garden opened because we had the snow. It was a very late spring. So we opened and the snow had really only just a week ago. It had melted. Same with the vulfeniana, that's also straight after snow melt that they will flower. And Primula minima the same. But minima, these two will grow on limestone, and this one needs slightly acidic than the Eastern Alp plant. More of the Eastern Alps, Primula tyrolensis. We only have one plant, sort of planted in under a tree on a cliff face or a rock face, so that it doesn't have too much snow standing on it, because it's from the Dolomites and it's not very keen to be buried under snow for a long time. It's in a shady area as well. Sometimes I think what's going to be interesting, these plants are they're really old. This tyrolensis is, Dieter planted it in the 70s. Doesn't make seed. When it flowered, these early primulas, there's very few pollinators flying, and maybe this one, because it doesn't like to self, doesn't have seed. Anyway, and some other typical Eastern Alp plants, Saponaria pumila. If anyone who's been up to Grossglockner will have seen the Dianthus alpinus. Also nice when you take a side view, but very good markings on the alpinus, although the best Dianthus for having most attractive markings is Calizonis. This is from the Carpathians, an endemic to, I think it's the Siebengebirgen. Sorry, I don't know English name. That Königstein is the place where it's called. In a nature reserve, I very seldom see seed offered of this. We do from the wild, almost never. From other gardens now and again. But now Dianthus do freely pollinate, hybridize with each other. So we have tried to isolate this and hand pollinate, but so far without any success. Also a very old plant. This is 75. Okay, now what used to be, but this is actually no longer happens or hasn't for more than 10 years, 12 years, is that in the middle of summer we'll have snow, and it used to always snow when the Lilium Yankea was in full flower. It'd snow on the flowers, and lilies don't like snow. Lily flowers would be gone. The next day they'd start to get all glassy and fall off. Same with graupel, they don't appreciate any cold. They like it to be warm and hot. You know, it's cool feet and hot heads for the lilies. This blockhouse is where the two gardeners who work on the Schachen live during the summer. We have solar panels for our electricity and also to pump the water from our spring, which is outside the garden and a little bit lower down, and pump the water up to a reservoir above the garden, and then from that reservoir we get the water pressure from the gravity. Everything's solar except for cooking. We do have a gas stove, and we also have a wood stove, which when we have this sort of weather, because we don't have any heating, but we've got a very nice wood stove and heater, and like an Agar, and that's also our heater. And there's some plants, of course, high alpines like the Campanula alpina, that they don't mind if it snows on them when they're flowering. This snow won't lie long. It'll be perhaps 2 days, 3 days at the most, and then it'll be gone. Another fairly good collection in the garden, and there's some old plants, but some new additions of the Caucasus. My botanist, Andreas Gerger, he's collected in the Georgian Caucasus, quite a number of collection trips that he's done there, and things that he's brought back, the Daphne glomerata, this Primula amoena, it was in culture before, but he bought new stock, and Saxifraga aucheri. Glomerata is another plant that likes to have a cool, wet summer, won't grow in Munich. We've tried it. When we first got the seed, we got good germination. So then we'll always try it in Munich and try it in the Alpine show house and try it on the Schachen and see where it does best. It died everywhere except the Schachen, where it does very well. More of the Caucasus collections from Andreas. The lilium isn't really a alpine, but it's sort of high meadows where that will grow, that's found. And then the lilies. Lilies are very nice. I really like them. And Lilium monodelphum, this one is quite a tall growing one. I would guess at least 50 centimeters, half a meter. Rocky Mountains, a bit difficult to find plants from the Rockies that grow in this wet climate that we have, purely because the plants that grow on the wet slopes of the Rockies, those are not the ones that are collected for the trade. That's not the ones that people are interested in. These Androsaces do well. Well, this one, Levigata, does very well. Nivalis, unfortunately, was short-lived. I think about 4 years, and then that died. So, if I find they don't do well, then I'll move on and try something else, like the Zigodanus, which surprised me that did well, does well, and Primula parry does very well as well. But Primula parry, its geographical range is from New Mexico all the way up to Montana, and it's always found growing right on the banks of streams, mountain streams. And that's what I also look for when I'm looking for new plants to try from the Rockies or from anywhere. And you look where they grow and you think, okay, it's a dryish climate, but it's growing right on the bank of a stream. There's a good chance, or in a moor, that it'll grow on the Schachen. Because we can't keep plants dry. We can do a little bit with drainage or with putting them in a crevice, but it's easier to just grow the ones that like it wet. And then if we have a dry week or two, then we can water them. Something that I'm very pleased that grows up there is the Castanea. This is a semi-parasitic plant. This one is parasitized most probably on the erigeron that's down here, the small little plant. And I had actually thought the Schachen would be a bit too cool in summer and too wet, but maybe also thanks to our changing climate, this one is doing well. I grew it from seed. I planted the seed directly at the roots of this erigeron, and it took 2 years to germinate, 3 years the first flowers. So I'm very pleased with that. The Polemonium also growing in a crack, so it's well drained, then they do well. These are all ones that like it moister. The Rothrocky is something that we do have to keep. Tanzania we'll have to keep repropagating, but it makes copious seeds and it's easy to grow again, just to bring it to flower. Now, something that's fairly new for the Schachen are the Southern Hemisphere. When I started up here in '94, I was told Southern Hemisphere plants, they won't grow on the Schachen because our summers are too cool and not enough sunshine, not enough heat. Then I first tried with one of the Lesotho plants, a higher forb. So it's alpine, but it's not a small little growing one, and it did very well. So then we start looking for Southern Hemisphere plants that grow in moist areas. We now have 2 groups with them. They do very well. I mean, the Orisia does excellently. Even this Alsunium does very well up here. The Calmisias as well. In 2005, I did an exchange, horticultural exchange program with Katsi Botanic Garden in Lesotho, together with Bongani and Loko, who worked at Katsi at that time. I did over the years, I think we did all in all about 4 different collecting trips to wet areas of the Lesotho Drakensberg. This collection has done very well on the Schachen. They need a dry winter. So the Schachen is perfect as long as we have snow. And so far the snow hasn't let us down, because the snow, under the snow, they're kept dry. The snow melts and they take a while to come into growth. They like the soil to warm up before they start growing. So it means that these plants, which are sort of like early summer flowering, for us, they're mid to late summer flowering plants, which is fine because they fill a gap when we don't have a lot in flower. Though the Himalayan plants are mainly finished by the time these start flowering, the indigenous Flora is also finished. So this is then our peak for August. This is just a board from this partnership. The same board is down in Katsi Alpine Botanic Garden. We've got some really interesting plants. I planted the Masonia about, I think it was 3 years ago. And we had plenty of plants in Munich, and I thought, well, why not try it on the Schachen? It flowers very late. It's in Lesotho, it will flower November, so beginning of their summer. And on the Schachen, it flowers in August. Takes longer, but it's nice because it stays nice and compact, as it is in nature as well, where you can find it in Lesotho. Whereas in Munich, it's always a little bit leggy. Other things that have done well, Rhodohypoxis. The first time I planted them, this plant actually, it flowered the year after planting. I bought it in actually, and then we had a winter where the snow came late and we had a lot of rain beforehand. So the Rhodohypoxis didn't like that. But I've planted some again in a slightly different area where the snow lies no matter what, that we don't get any snow blown, or the winds won't get the snow and blow it away. Diaceas do well. We also have a number of the higher forbs from the Lesotho Drakensberg. It's just an interesting Asteraceae. Interesting. I find the seeds very nice and also very attractive flowers. The backs of the petals are very attractive. And these are all plants that like to grow moist. Berkea, structurally very pleasing, but these are thistles. These are extremely prickly all the way up to the sepals of the flower. And this plant, I'll show it again. This is the Senecio macrocarpus. This, unfortunately, we're going to have to get rid of because it has the propensity to be a weed. But the Berkea is very nice. That's not weedy at all. Cnipophias, also the caulescens grows well up on the Schachen. Flowers very late, but can see this is sort of like an autumn flowering instead of it's really as should be flowering summertime. But now this is just to show one thing we have to watch out for is that we don't introduce any weeds. We're in the middle of a nature protection area, even though there's grazing out there. This is a plant that the cattle are extremely unlikely to graze. It has very sticky leaves, and Seneциos are very often poisonous. I have no idea if this one is poisonous. This photo is taken in Lesotho, up on the top of Mafikalisuri Pass, about 3,000 meters. It will grow on anything. It doesn't matter if it's stony or if it's peat or if it doesn't matter, it grows. So we'll most probably get do away with it. Anyway, this just want to show you a little bit of what the work we've been doing recently on the Schachen. This is right near the entrance of the garden. We always had an area that was just the indigenous plants, and it was them growing naturally, and it wasn't very attractive for the visitors. So I thought, well, let's build a crevice garden. This is just one corner of it. And we started this 2002, quite by chance. This was built by Pierre Stepke. He worked up there with me at that time. Harold Schadel was up there as a volunteer. He volunteers, well, not volunteers, he works at Schachen Alpine in Switzerland as well, doing their rock work. And Dominic Turnbull, who a lot of people might know, who's very good with crevice gardens. And it was just quite by chance that Dominic was visiting me when we just started clearing this area to build a crevice. And he straight away, we collected rocks and started, he showed us how the best ways to place them and to build it. And then Pierre carried on in the year after and built it. These rocks are natural formations, and then we just built onto it. And it's done very well. This is Campanula rhinari, Selene elisabeta. What I'm hoping, I mean, this is still early days, is that it's going to give us an area where we can grow plants that need it a little bit drier and sunnier. This is south facing. It is snow-free about 3 weeks earlier than the rest of the garden. And up to now, we haven't been able to grow plants like Adrianthus on the Schachen. It's too wet. I've planted Physoplexus here as well, and various Campanula that usually are there from Turkey. So we'll see how that goes. Now, just to end off, I wanted to show the meadows outside and the nature outside the Alpine Garden. This is looking from the entrance of the garden over the meadows to the Schachenwand, this is called. These meadows are all slightly acidic. So we've got different floras. We've got plants that need acid, and we've got plants that like to have limestone. The screes, of course, are all limestone. Early before the garden opens, Primula auricula, Primula farinosa. Straight after snow melt, you'll have hundreds and hundreds flowering in what's called Schachengrund. This snow will usually lie all through July as well, because they're fairly shaded for most of the day. Also in this area, Selenia caulis, although you get better examples growing further up the mountain, because here the grass is actually does get fairly tall. Number of gentians. I'm not showing all of the gentians, but these are the main ones. We've also got Gentiana caulis, which grows on the acidic Ribler soil, and Vienna that usually grows in the cracks in the rock. The Martis alpina, which is the one that creeps more than climbs. Various terrestrial orchids. This Gymnadenia, that is a weed in the Alpine Garden. We used to leave it for years and years, thought how pretty, how nice, and now it's just starting to take over. So it's no longer allowed to sow seed, so after flowering I cut it down, and I've actually now started to dig it out. There's too much of it. This also is not a weed, but this is the Suloglossum viride, and unfortunately this is not in the garden, but it's not that far away, Nigritella nigra and Traunsteiner. Another thing that does very well in the Alpine Garden is the Lilium martagon, seeds a bit too freely. Campanulas outside. Here it's only the Pannonica is indigenous. We've got Lutea in the garden, and I've never been able to find out, I'm not sure if this is a natural hybrid or if this is, the name is further up here, but I forget it, or if it's a man-made hybrid. It's a much weaker plant, but it's a hybrid between Pannonica and Lutea, and can have very attractive flowers. And I just quickly wanted to show another thing with the propagation, because we've had a lot of trouble trying to propagate the taller gentians, like Lutea and Purpurea, Pannonica. They don't like to be transplanted. They don't like to be pricked out. The roots are very sensitive for almost all gentians. They don't like to be disturbed. So a couple of years back, I tested it with just sowing directly into these tree pots, and the tree pots are very tall and they've done very well. And I've feed, and this is last year. This year we'll plant them out. They're for the rock garden in Munich, as well as some of them Purpurea will be for the Schachen as well. some of the late summer flowers from outside on the meadows. And then if you go further up the mountain, here's the Alpine Garden, our neighbors. This is the Schachen, the King's House, Schachen Schloss, and this is Schachen House, where an overnighting hut. And there's a hiking path up there, and it follows along the horizon there. Very, very nice stands of the Saxifraga aetsoides and Caesia along these rocks, and up on these are grazing fields for the sheep. Nice things of cotton grass, Erioforum schweizeri, and you can see much nicer stands of Silenia caulis up here as well. Petrocallis and Soldanella. And of course, I don't work in the garden alone. There are a lot of people over the years that have worked there, have helped, spent a lot of time up there. This is Bongani Loco from Lesotho. He was up there. Unfortunately, when he was up there, they had snow. He was there for a week. First day was misty. The next day, 20 centimeters of snow, and that stayed until he left. This was beginning of June. Well, not beginning, middle of June, beginning of the season. Thomas was one of our gardeners who worked up there for many years, but he's now moved to a different, he comes now as a volunteer. He no longer works in Munich. So Philip, who was at the Alpine Garden, the Vogesen, Haute de Châtelet. Kenton Seth was up there for a couple of weeks. Same as Aaron Marshall from Edinburgh Botanics also came through the Merlin Trust, and Josh Tranter was the AGS trainee horticulturist. He was with us last year. And from Munich, there's Claudia works with me, Claudia Nagler and Gabi Schroeder. So it's all women now. When I started, it was unusual that women were allowed to work up there. We have no mechanization in the garden. Our paths are too small, too narrow. So fetching rocks is a major thing. This is a practicant, 2 students that worked up there, and Claudia, and with a board, they managed to roll this rock up. We were redoing an area and we needed more rocks. Rocks are always a big problem. We never have enough. The wider paths, we can use a sack trolley. Here, I just wanted to show when we have problems in some areas with what we call root weeds, weeds that make rhizomes and spread through rhizomes. When we clear the area to replant and redo it, we'll flame the soil. We'll take out the top bit of soil and then still flame the underneath parts and flame the rocks to try to keep the root weed down. It's best to actually clear the whole plant group and do the whole plant group, but we can't always do that. Our wood comes from Munich. Nature protection area, we can't fell the trees for wood, thank goodness. That would be just another job. We'd have to have an extra 2 weeks if we had to fell the trees for our wood. And that's excellent work for bad weather. Now, if anybody would like to see during the winter, this is how I can see how much snow do we have up on the Schachen. As you can see, it's quite a few years ago, but I know there's snow there at the moment. And this is from our neighbor at the Meiler hut. And looking down, this is Schachen, the King's House, Schachen Schloss, Schachen House. You can't quite see the garden, but we're just below the King's House. Then I can have an idea, okay, there's still plenty of snow, can relax. Like this is taken, the garden is on the right-hand side, not in the picture, but this is February year before last. A good amount of snow. Our neighbor, he goes up there sometimes on skis in winter and has a look. The area is actually, it's not a skiing area, it's an avalanche area. It's closed during winter. Only the locals go up. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. If anyone wants to see what's flowering the next season, I do try to post on Facebook or Instagram things that are in flower at that time. Okay, thank you.